What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, made in the image of God, and we don't apologize for it. Strong, dominant, and control. Today is a little bit of a fun and special episode. A lot of times we get deep and philosophical, but today we're going to have a nice chat about knives, something I think manly. So gather around in this virtual tribe, in this virtual campfire, and let's discuss knives. I posed this question to the patrons, and it got a lot of feedback, so I thought it would be a good episode. One knife. If you could only have one knife. Period. One knife. That's all you get. What would that knife be? One of the patrons said a double blade 4 to 4.5 inch. And I said, you mean like a dagger? And he said, yes, sir. So we see a 4-inch double-edged dagger here, 4 to 4.5 inch. One of the other patrons said, I like something a bit bigger. 5 to 7 inch blade, no choil, no finger grooves, straight handle, drop point or clip point, saber grind or high flat grind, 3/16 inch blade, micarta scales, no G10 or wood. Steel isn't as important as heat treat. Solid kydex sheath, no holster, lots of eyelets to sew on molly, soft plastic loops, eventually crack, or a nice dangler with steel or thick aluminum dangler if it's going on a belt. Square spine, so I can get sparks off a ferro rod. Ferro groove would be better. Think slightly reduced size K-bar with no stamped steel guard and screw on micarta handles. And a nice kydex sheath. I'll take that knife all day. So I'm going to touch back. I know that was a lot, but I think some good points here. He said 5 to 7 inches. That's his preferred range. So we see 5 to 7 inch. So he's going a bit bigger. He says no finger grooves. And the first one I didn't mention, but a double-sided dagger in general does not have finger grooves either. So we see no finger grooves. Drop point or clip point blade. If you don't know, that's a very classic kind of design. He likes micarta scales. He says no G10 or wood. If you don't know the difference between micarta and G10, I don't want to get too nerdy into this episode, but he prefers micarta. Solid kydex sheath. I agree with that. I like kydex. As much as I like the look and appearance of leather, I think a good modern kydex sheath has a lot of advantages. He says steel is not as important as heat treat. I would agree with that. Like if you have a good steel with a crappy heat treat, it doesn't really matter. But I would submit that steel also is important depending on your application. The sharp spine, I like that as well. I like to make fires with a ferro rod. I like a ferro rod groove as well. So we see a lot here. Now this one's coming from, I have an insider chat that people can choose to be a part of for patrons, and then I have just a Patreon page. Not everybody wants to be part of the insider chat because they don't have or like Facebook. I don't really have any love for Facebook, but when I proposed it, it was the most common platform that most people had. So that's what we have, but this comes from just a Patreon page. With what I currently own, it will be a Condor Swamp Romper, then Ontario SK4. I looked up both of these knives, the Condor Swamp Romper and then the Ontario SK4. Both look like really good choices, and we see a theme here. Really good, around 4-inch blade. So everything here has been between 4 and 7 inches. Everything thus far has been a fixed blade. I don't think anything so far has had finger grooves. With the exception of the dagger, clip point or drop point blades. Just a good usable design. One of the other patrons said a cold steel M16, light and easy to carry for everyday urban. So this brings up a good point. This is the first folding knife that's come up, and a lot of people carry folding knives day to day. I generally EDC a fixed blade. I don't think many people do. Some people do, but I think the vast majority carry a a folding knife. And when I say one knife, a lot of people jump to the end of the world apocalypse, zombie chipmunks running around fighting AI robot zombies, whatever your version of the apocalypse is. Like, if I could only have one knife for that, it's going to be, this Rambo knife. And to be fair, nobody's really pointing out a Rambo knife. But this guy is thinking more everyday urban carry, what he does day to day. And a lot of people day to day carry a folding knife. The CRKT M16, Columbia River Knife and Tool. M16 is a classic, iconic model, if you want to call it a model, kind of like the AR-15 is a model. And it encompasses many, many actual individual knives, from Tonto blades to more traditional blades, partially serrated. The CRK M16 is one of the staples, I think, of American EDC, and that would be his choice for urban everyday carry. I think it's a solid choice, especially for urban. And one of the patrons suggested the White River Firecraft 3.5, which you might know if you've listened in times of yore. But that is my go-to knife. I've said before, this is kind of why I asked this question, if I could only have one knife, that's the knife that I would pick. And I'm blessed to own many knives, but if I could only have one knife, that White River 3.5 Firecraft absolutely would be my one knife of everything that I'm aware of now. If you've heard this before, forgive me for the redundancy, but probably many haven't. So, I got it when I was the commander of a tactical team, and I had for years carried a folding knife in my pocket. I think for years it was a Gerber Auto, 06 Auto, which is a good knife, especially a good formidable weapon. But when I started thinking about and practicing ground fighting, I thought, if I have to get somebody off me right now for ground fighting on the ground, then I have a bit of ground fighting experience, wrestling experience, grappling experience. It's a lot less likely that I'm going to be able to get the knife out and deploy it, especially if I'm wrestling around and probably only have one hand. Even with a folding auto, that really reduces the chances that I'm going to get that knife into the fight quickly. A fixed blade knife that I can just grab and use, much more likely. So I started carrying a fixed blade knife. I bought this knife for that application. Ironically, it's made for bushcraft and making fires. It's called the Firecraft. But I initially got it for tactical application. So right there we see a great crossover. It's also great. I've used it since living, if you don't know, my wife and I live as neo-nomads, live large chunks off grid. And I like to make fires in the bush, in the backcountry. And it's great for that. It's a great thing to have in your pocket. It's one of my go-to and like my favorite go-to EDC knife. Great for all manner of things. It's not the best at everything, but it's a good usable size knife. It's a fixed blade knife, 3.5-inch blade. It's got a thin but very strong blade. Mine is S35VN. They make different steels, but S35VN I think is the most common. They made a run in 3V that I would have liked to have had, but I already had the S35VN. I just think it's a phenomenal all-around choice. It's big enough to do anything that I would need it to do, and small enough that I can everyday carry it. It's a good balance. I've got bigger, beefier knives, and I tried going bigger for EDC, and I have an SE4, which I think same blade steel, S35VN. The SE4, you wouldn't think the 4-inch blade is that much bigger, but it's a massively bigger knife. It's just heavier, it's beefier. It's fine if I'm, going to go do bushcrafty survival stuff for the entire day, but not so good if I'm, walking around Walmart. It's just a bit too big and bulky for general everyday use. It's a fine knife, but I think it's not as good a balance as that White River Firecraft 3.5. I'm not sponsored by White River. I don't know if they've ever heard of me or the show. It's just a really good knife. And I started thinking about this and kind of timeless designs. The first one mentioned that dagger. We see that all throughout history. We see examples from ancient times. I mean, ancient Egypt, Romans, the Pugio. They had these, not small knives, but a decent-sized dagger. the kind that was first described by one of the patrons. It's a timeless design. It is a fantastic knife, especially for defense. For a straight defensive tool, if that's what you're going to do with it, yeah, that 4.5 to 5 inch dagger, I think, is kind of arguably one of your best options depending on your fighting style. And I have some knife fighting experience, not the most, because I mostly focus on firearms. You probably know that if you listen to Gunfighter Life. But it's a great design. You see it replicated all throughout history. Again, from ancient Egyptians to the Romans. You see it in the Sykes Fairbairn. You see it in the Applegate Fairbairn knife. You see it in many times throughout history popping up. And that has to lead me to believe that it's because it's a good design. It keeps coming up throughout history, throughout culture. We also see this kind of classic design. Although the White River is very modern, really good steel, really good blade material, handle material. If you look at it, it's strikingly similar to a knife when I was doing my research that showed up in a 1st century Roman era dig where they uncovered it. And it looks, the similarities are striking, even to the circle on the handle. I mean, it looks remarkably similar. The similarities are striking. It's not exactly the same, and obviously the steel is going to be much better today. The handle material is much better practically than wood. It may not look as pretty, but if you look at the similarities on those knives, it's striking between that 1st century Roman knife and that White River Firecraft. They're not identical, but they're really close. And I should mention, somebody mentioned a Condor knife. I've never owned a Condor knife, but Condor makes an exact replica of that knife discovered in a 1st century Roman tomb. It's called something Roman, like Lost Roman or something like that. But you could get basically the same knife, probably with much better steel, if you wanted like an exact replica. But I don't think you need an exact replica. I'm not putting that knife up on a pedestal, but it tells me that if that knife got uncovered and it looks remarkably similar to these practical, let's say 3 to 5 inch blade. That's the vast majority of stuff that people talked about. A 3 to 5 inch blade, fixed blade knife. Now the double-sided knife, again, if it's just for defense, is good. The single edge, I think, in my opinion, is better for utility. Not that you can't carve a notch in a stick to lift a pot out of a fire, or to make a bird snare trap or a deadfall trap. You can do it with a double-edged knife, but it's a little bit easier, in my opinion, with a single-edged knife. Also, if you're butchering animals, I'm big into hunting and big game hunting. Been a professional big game hunter and guide, which requires butchering a lot of animal. You know, butchering a bison, butchering an elk. It's a lot of work. I prefer a single-edged knife for that, especially when I'm reaching up, putting my hand on the blade to carve out a heart, lungs, things like that. I like a single-edged knife. I prefer a clip point. But that single edge, for utility, I think, is a more utilitarian design than a double-edged dagger. But for straight fighting, yeah, double-edged dagger has a lot of advantages. But we see these two designs kind of recreated, remade throughout history. And that tells me that there is something timeless about them. Here's what I want to encourage you as a man. Have a knife, carry a knife. Not in place of a gun, in addition to a gun, unless you live in a place where your right to self-protection has been limited. But even if you have a gun, you should still have a knife. A knife is one of the quintessential man tools for anything from butchering game to cutting up an apple to cutting a foreign object out of your own body. Whatever the case may be, a good sharp knife, I think as a man you should have. And not just Amazon click. There's probably guys out there that have a vast knife collection, but have never butchered a deer or an elk or anything like that. Know how to use your knife. There's probably guys that have vast fighting knife collections that have never trained in knife fighting. I'd say if you're going to carry a knife, know how to use it. Know how to use it for defense. Know how to use it to butcher an animal. Know how to use it to do day-to-day tasks. And know how to sharpen it. Know how to sharpen your own knives. I don't think there's even anything wrong with, if you want your everyday EDC knife to be super sharp, sending it off to have a professional do it. But you ought to be able to, I think, as an alpha male, put a good, workable, usable edge on your knives. Now, I don't know the exchange rate and inflation and whatever, but here's some good news. I have to think that in Roman times, a good steel, metal, iron knife was quite expensive. Today, even a moderately priced knife is going to almost certainly have better steel, better corrosion resistance, better edge retention, better uniformity, sharper, and retain an edge better than even the best, most wealthy, Gucci knife of the time, thousands of years ago. They did the best they could with what they had at the time, but you have access to better technology, better metallurgy today, better handle materials. As pretty as wood is, as one of the patrons pointed out, micarta, I guess he doesn't like G10, but either G10 in my opinion or micarta, they're fantastic. They're a good blade material. If you want a wood handle, that's fine, but from a practical standpoint, I think it's pretty obvious that micarta and things like that are a better option. And you can get a knife like that probably, if you're listening to this and you're in the Western world, probably for less than a month's salary. I don't know what a good Roman knife would have cost, but I have to imagine it was fairly spendy from what I know about history and weaponry and things like that. So that's some good news. You have access to really, really good steel, really, really good handle materials, really good designs at decent prices. And again, I have several knives. I have quite a few knives. I'm blessed to have different knives. But here's the thing. I think as a man, if you're just learning the basics, maybe just get a budget knife and beat it up and learn how to sharpen it. But once you're ready to EDC a serious knife, get a good knife. There are few things out of all the stuff that we have. My wife and I live as neo-nomads. The cool millennial vernacular would be, I don't consider myself a millennial, but would be living tiny. We carry everything that we own with us, unless my mom has stuff from when I was a kid. But you get the idea, and even we will concede that we have way more stuff than we need. The stuff we spend money on, the stuff that you're going to spend your money on, I would submit should be the things that are really important to you and the things that you use every day. A really good Bible. A really good Bible. A really good EDC loadout. A good knife that's good for defense, that's good for utility purposes, a good one. Not a gas station special unless that's all you can afford. A good one. A good combat fighting handgun. If you live in a place where you can, I think you should be able to put meat on the table as a man. So the ability to do that. But especially the stuff you're going to carry day to day, that stuff should be quality. That stuff should be good. If it was going to be your one knife, if it was going to be your one handgun, if today Great Tribulation started and you, for whatever reason, got separated from everything but what you had on you, your everyday carry, would you be happy with it? Would you be happy with your knife? Would you be happy with your gun? Or would you wish you had something else? And if that's the case, do you have 5 other knives that still aren't something that you would want, or 5 other handguns, but the one that you really would want, you don't have? I would say be circumspect and consider that. Consider that philosophy. I'm not saying you can't have stuff. I'm not saying you can't collect stuff. There's nothing wrong with that, but the stuff that you're going to have and use every day, like your EDC, I'd say have what's best for you, what's most fitting for you. Anyway, with that, probably going to start wrapping up this episode, the Just One Knife episode. If it's for an EDC knife that you might use on food and stuff, I've given this tip before, but I advise you to just use food-grade oil. That's it. I don't care if it's coconut oil, I don't care if it's cheap canola oil, whatever, right? Olive oil, a good quality food grade oil. Why? Because if it's your EDC, you might use it on food, right? If I'm cutting open a duck or a goose, probably don't want CLP. If you don't know what that is, it's like a harsh chemical petroleum-based gun lubricant. It's a fine lubricant, but I probably don't want that on my knife if I'm butchering a goose or a deer. I don't want that on my meat. But if it's got a little bit of olive oil on it or coconut oil, I don't care. So if you have your tactical knife for your body armor vest, you want to put CLP on that, that's fine. But my advice for an EDC knife, or many knives that you might use for food prep, if you want to preserve those, just use a good cooking oil, right? Again, from what I know about ancient history and Rome and stuff like that, I don't know that they knew much about or used a lot of petroleum oils. They might have had like tar and pitch and things like that, and who knows what Greek fire was. But they likely used olive oil on armor and weapons and things like that, because that's the oil that they had. And I'm not telling you go out and throw away your CLP and run your Glock 19 or something better with olive oil, although it probably would work. But I'm saying on an EDC knife, it makes a lot of sense to lube that knife and keep it rust-free with just a good food-grade oil. Your tactical verse of the day, I really can think of none better, although I've probably used it before. The words of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Sword, right? They had different words for different weapons, different things. A sword. A sword is a defensive weapon. A sword is a weapon. It's not generally used. You could cut an apple with it, right? You could probably make a sandwich with it, but that's not what it was used for. A sword was used to fight. Think about that. Jesus told his disciples, if you have no sword, sell your cloak and buy one. There's also pretty clear teachings on when and when not to use deadly force, which is it's kind of its own thing. But let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.